website. How many people run like a personal blog? Right? Okay. Yeah. Those of you who don't, do you know what blogging is? It's like microblogging a little longer. Yeah, so, okay, so how many people go through a flow like this? So you write a blog post, right, or you write an article. How many people are actually just like straight up journalists here? Handfuls. Okay, so you write an article, you write a blog post, you post it on the internet, and then after you do that, if your system doesn't do this for you, you cross-post it to Twitter and Facebook. Anybody? Yeah? That's how you get all the juice. That's how you get the word out. Yeah? Okay, so here's a scene. So this happens to me, and I'm going to expect that it happens to you too. So you do that, right? And then people start responding, saying, you know, at Waka, hey, that was awesome, right? Or they start commenting on Facebook post and saying, oh, this was a really great post, I learned a lot. Or maybe you'd asked a question, and you start getting answers and responses, right? So what happens, and maybe you get some in the actual comments on your original post, right? So what happens is this online discussion that you're starting to create is now fragmented, right? And it's okay, there's lots of desktop tools, right, that will aggregate it back in, you know, the tweet decks and that. And so you can sort of stay on top of it, right? And there's a whole, like, there is a job now that is doing this, right? The social media experts, right, that sit in TweetDeck all day and sort of pull all this in. Okay, so we've sort of worked our way around it. So I think, you know, there's a handful of us on the internet that think that's just a totally broken way to solve this, right? But it's sort of working for people right now, right? They're aggregating it back in and sort of doing these distributed conversations about their original content. So here's something that happened to me that really sort of kicked my passion about this. I did one of these, like, and I don't remember what it was. It was a couple years ago, but I asked a question, and I got some really great feedback. And I was like, oh, this is awesome, right? 6 months, whatever it was, 9 months later, I said, I remember I asked that, and I got really good responses, right? Let's say it was where to go for dinner in San Francisco. So I went back to my original post and tried to recreate all the answers. And you know what? I couldn't, right? Like, they were gone. They were off. Like, some of them were in Twitter because it had happened more than 2 weeks ago in Twitter. It was like wormholed, right? Never to be seen on the internet again. The Facebook post, you know, I couldn't quite dig up because there'd been so much activity in Facebook. And I couldn't just go back to my original post and see all of the great answers that I'd had and pick through them, right? So how many people have heard of tools like Discuss? Because I will totally point fingers and name names. Yeah. Anybody using Discuss? Anybody using Backtype? No? Sorry, I got too obscure there. Anyway, so there are centralized systems that are now trying to solve this, right? That will give you sort of a centralized comment stream and slap it on your site, right? I won't spend too long explaining why centralized systems are bad, but you don't own that content, right? It can go away at any time, with or without notice, including the stuff that's happening on Facebook and Twitter, mind you. You know, $50 billion valuations aside. That content is not actually yours and could actually go away. So Salmon is, and Philip introduced us as open web people. Is that a phrase people have heard? We're like these weird, dark people, like, shouting about the freedom of the internet.
With too much facial hair.
With too much facial hair. Oh, Paul's not quite fit to the name yet.
I am not growing a beard for this.
So the open web, particularly thanks to Mozilla, has come to mean a lot in a lot of things. For me, it's always meant this sort of freedom of information, right? And particularly the ability to control two important things. One is your identity, which is something I'd be happy to spend way more than 10 minutes talking about. And the second is your content, right? And so this is what Philip was alluding to, this sort of data portability idea, right? So from both ends, like if you are running a blog, a website, you know, whatever it is that accepts comments, right? Like you want part of that conversation to stay with the rest of the conversation. There's a flip side to that. If you are a commenter, right? And Philip again sort of alluded to this. If I go and post comments all over, like that's stuff in some cases I'm spending time thinking about composing, and I actually wrote that, right? And it might be nice for some of us to have a record of like what are the things that I contributed to, what were the conversations I took spot in. So there's sort of data ownership on both sides here. So those of us in the dark corners of the internet shouting about openness and freedom, we're working on several protocols to sort of help do the kinds of things that people are doing right now, like the real-time conversations on Twitter and Facebook, and all this stuff which, like, not to knock them. It's really great stuff, right? It's opening all kinds of new interactions between people. It's enabling people. It's engaging people. But it's doing so in a way that's actually very fragile and dangerous, right? It's doing so on privately held servers by privately held companies. And if you are responsible or have an interest in your brand, right, like you're giving a lot away. So Salmon is a protocol that's sort of a piece of a larger suite to sort of help do all of this interaction, all this real-time sort of discussion in a way that sort of happens cross-site. So we don't have to put everything into a single silo. How's that? Yeah? Okay. Yeah. So Salmon, so those of us that blog, how many people have been blogging for about 4 or 5 years or more? So, okay, so those hands that went up probably remember a thing called trackback. Really easy comment spam. Right. So Salmon comes from a similar sort of idea as trackback, but obviously, trackback fell into a dark hole, and we wanted to do it sort of a little bit better this time. But the idea is sort of the same, right? Like if you post or comment about something elsewhere, that should be reflected back on the original content. So Salmon has the same thing, and so the name Salmon is that comment or whatever you add into the conversation swims back upstream to the original discussion, right? And we call that slapping. So it's very fun to talk about. So on to the demo. So Paul here has 2 websites. One is paulosman.me, which is his blog. He's a very prolific writer, as you can tell. Yeah, so he's got a blog post there about the work that he's doing at Mozilla. And we've got another sort of example site, right? So called FriendFeed, which is probably going to get us into trouble with Facebook, but we're not already. But yeah, so just like FriendFeed, so a real-time sort of aggregator. And in his FriendFeed site, he's subscribed to the feed of that initial, right? So people have used FriendFeed. We're not making jokes that are falling on deaf ears. Wow, really? Only 2 people use
Google
FriendFeed?
Reader?
Okay, Google Reader would be another example. Any of these sort of aggregators, right? The tools that people are using to sort of bring in all these conversations from around the web, right? So this is an aggregator. So it's actually pulled this article about shiptanewdrumbeat.org from paulosman.me, right? And so one of the features of FriendFeed and the tools like it, and actually Facebook itself does this as well, right? You can get information coming in, and then you can comment directly within Facebook or here directly within FriendFeed on that article, right? So he's on eval.ca/feeds, and he's just going to post a comment here. All right, so standard sort of online commenting system. Note he's not logging in, right? He's just filling out his information. Clicks comment. Yeah, so it's demo code, but yeah, he gets a very friendly message. Thank you for your comment. Right, and now you can see, like, in this feed aggregator. So the 3 of us who have used FriendFeed know, like, this. We did this a lot. 2 minutes. Right, so the comment. So now there's a discussion, right? The original post happened on his blog, but now there's this whole sort of other discussion happening over in this aggregator site. But if we go back to paulosman.me. And probably do a refresh. Down at the bottom, you'll see that same comment has now shown up on his site as well, right? So 6 months from now, when Paul goes to say, hey, what did people think about me launching a new drumbeat.org? He can see that he thought it was pretty cool. Right? So that's the general gist. So why is it different from trackback? Well, there's a whole lot of sort of technical bits underneath, which I'd be happy to sort of address specifically in the question and answer. But basically what happens is you'll notice when Paul fills out, in the standard comment form here, you have these 2 fields, an email address and a URL. And when people fill those out, we actually do what we call discovery, right? So we find out a little bit of information about that. And in that process, we can add some keys for cryptography, right? And so in my last minute, I'll explain the cryptography. Just kidding. Yeah, but basically what we can do is we can discover the keys and actually do a signed message exchange, right? So that we know. The problem with trackback was it just allowed anybody to post anything to that, right? So spammers figured that out. They're like, oh, we'll just start dumping, WoW Gold ads and, other stuff into your comment stream. But what we actually do is say, okay, here's a block of text. Did that actually come from you, right? Was it cryptographically signed from you? And so that's the little bit of magic that happened behind the scenes there. So I think that's our 10 minutes. So we got time for questions and answers.